everybody. Welcome to today's leadership conversation. I am so excited about today's guest, Dr. Cyndi Parker. Cyndi, I met you, or actually I heard you teach at the Infusion Bible Conference. I don't think we actually met there. Then I heard you teach at another Bible conference, and I was like, I've got to meet this lady. And so I came up and talked to you, and we chatted for a while, and I invited you onto this video, and you said yes, and I was so excited. Because ever since I heard you teach at the Infusion Bible Conference, I started just Googling and finding anything I could find because I just fell in love with your teaching. And so I want to tell my audience about you, because my audience probably isn't the typical audience that you're in front of. And I'm like, my audience needs to know Dr. Cyndi Parker. So Dr. Parker, you guys, she is a respected professor of Holy Land Studies at Israel Bible Center, of which I am enrolled in your class. All right.
Yes.
I'm enrolled in Listening to the Land of the Bible, part 1. I'm doing that class right now. I love it, enjoying it. She is absolutely passionate about geography of the land of Israel, and just extracts lessons that will blow your mind as she teaches that. She's also the host of Context Matters podcast and Israel Bible podcast, both of which you better start cranking those out quicker, because I'm catching up. I'm almost through all of them, and so I'm really enjoying.
Okay. Heard.
And then also the author of Encountering Jesus in the Real World of the Gospels. And I just recently bought that, and I am loving that. I'm reading the chapter on the woman at the well right now, and just loving it. So thank you for all of your content. You also run something called Narrative is Place, and I know you do Holy Land tours. That's on my bucket list, to go on a Holy Land tour with you one day. So anyway, Cyndi, thank you so much for being our guest today. I'm so excited about our conversation today. And what I want to start with is just asking you to share with us, how did you develop a passion for studying the geography of the land of the Bible? And how has that impacted your understanding of Scripture? Because you are passionate about this.
Well, one, thank you for that very kind introduction, and even just the invitation to be here with you, because one of the things I love is not just the chance to talk about what I'm passionate about, but to bring it to the table with someone who's very passionate like you about your specialty, and to be able to say, how do our two specialties blend? And because they're sitting at the table together, what more can we learn? So what can I learn from you, as well as anything that I have to contribute? So I love these conversations. Thank you for the invitation. The geography bit, I think, was a bit of a surprise to me. It wasn't anything that I went out to search for. Going to the Holy Land, seeing the geography, knowing the land was nothing I thought was important to do. I never wanted to go. I don't come from a family that thinks it's like a bucket list item.
Yeah.
And it really was just towards the end of my seminary training when I loved seminary. I loved what we were studying. It was really fun, but there was always a little bit that bothered me a bit in terms of, but are any of us implementing this in real life? And not only that, but how do we know the Israelites were real people? How do we know this whole thing isn't just a philosophy that we've made up somehow to make ourselves feel better? And as I was voicing some of these concerns, one of my professors told me, Cyndi, you need to go put the land under your feet and just experience it, and just smell it and feel it and touch the rocks. And he was suggesting that I go for 3 weeks, but I ended up going for a year. And then at the end of that year, I stayed and became part of staff and teaching staff at Jerusalem University College in Jerusalem.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Oh,
so that
wow.
was my 1 year as a student, 4 years full-time teaching it. And it was, I think for me, and I've used this analogy a few times, I think that growing up in the church or hearing stories, doing individual Bible stories or Bible studies which are delightful and wonderful and everyone should do. But what the effect of that can be is you study individual characters, but you don't know how one character relates to another character, or one story fits on the chronology with another story. And you have no idea if are they walking the same path? Are they looking at the same thing? And for me, my experience first of the land was simply taking these individual bubbles of stories and pulling them down onto the ground and realizing that they could become conversation partners with each other. And in fact, that's how the Israelites and the Jews have studied scripture like forever and ever. And it was just me and my culture that wasn't doing that. Yeah. And I just became infatuated with that kind of study. And so that pushed me down the geography route. And I've just loved it ever since. I keep learning more, and it keeps transforming even how I live in places in North America. Like, how do I live at home in a different way? And so, yeah, those kinds of things.
One of the things I heard you say, or I read it in one of your books or the podcast, I don't remember. And when you said it, I lit up because I had been picturing this in my head. And you were talking about Nazareth, where Jesus grew up as a child. Talk to me about that, how Mary and Joseph leveraged that location for Jesus' education.
Yeah, this is something that it's not written down in scripture. Yeah. And so you can't know it just by combing through the words of the Gospels. In fact, those early years of Jesus, there's very little information that you get about his growing up years in Nazareth. You get a few stories of his childhood, but they're so far and few between. And so it's really going and standing on location and looking around you that you begin to infer things. So we can't say for a fact, this is exactly what they did on Shabbat, but you can look around and go, if I lived here, this is what I would do. And so there's taking that idea of just learning from the landscape, but there's also realizing that places and landscape can hold on to memory. Mm-hmm. And so where you can just be thinking about what you're going to be eating for dinner, and you happen to look at something and suddenly you remember, oh, it was right over there that I signed a contract for my first book, or, something like that, right? So the places can spark your imagination and spark a memory. And so if we pull those two concepts together and you go stand just outside Nazareth, it was a very small little village nestled in this area on the Nazareth Ridge that didn't have very good water sources and not very good soil. But if you go just to the edge of the village, then you're looking down onto the southern landscape, which is the Jezreel Valley, and all the mountains that outline the Jezreel Valley. And as it is, those mountains and the valley itself, but mainly the mountains and ridges, hold on to so many different Israelite stories. Mm-hmm. And so in my sacred imagination, recognizing it's imagination, but I love to go, what if Mary and Joseph, or what if the local rabbi took 12 kids who are learning in school and they all just climb and scamper over rocks and they go to the edge of town and they just start looking at the landscape around them. And if you just look to the east, there's Mount Tabor, which brings up images of Deborah and Barak. And then you can look south into the east and you're looking at Mount Gilboa, and you can ask questions of the audience. Like, what do we think of our first king? And what happened when King Saul died up there? Do you think it's fair that Jonathan had to die with Saul? Right? Or Carmel, and go, oh, this great prophet that we had, Prophet Elijah. What was he doing on Mount Carmel? What about that conflict with the prophets of Baal? And just in looking at your horizon line, you're looking at your heritage and your history, and you can interrogate your history and you're learning it, and you can talk about questions of what is the faithfulness of God like? What is the standard of God for his leaders, of his people? And it's just putting yourself in an area where those kinds of questions can be asked. And I love that viewpoint in Nazareth for that very purpose.
Yeah. And it's like God intentionally placed him there to grow up in that location because of the significance up on that little hill that overlooked that area. And I do think there are implications, like you said, I mean, it's descriptive, not prescriptive, but still, I think there's the implications for discipleship and training your children is just huge in thought. So I love that. And like you said, that you find that in the land itself. So how can a deeper understanding of the geography, history, and culture of the land where Jesus lived and where he ministered provide us with insights into his leadership and communication styles?
There are so many interesting avenues we could go down with this question, but let's start with Nazareth. Because one of the other aspects of Nazareth, thinking of his growing up years, and why isn't it his home base and for his ministry when he enters ministry? And so one of the other aspects of Nazareth we could talk about is it's in this little basin and it's up on a hill, and there's a big valley to the north and a big valley to the south, big, massive trade routes down in those valleys. No one is purposefully walking uphill to visit Nazareth. They're just not. So there's something even just about the location of Nazareth that keeps it fairly traditional. It's there. You can look down on all of this international trade, the Roman soldiers who are walking everywhere, but you don't have to interact with them unless you want to. And when we see the geography and we just realize that's going to shape a little bit about how Jesus grows up. But when he enters into his public ministry, he starts going into very, very different kinds of geographical places. Yeah. So even if we stay in this political region of Galilee, in his public ministry, he moves to Capernaum, and Capernaum is on a major road. Capernaum is filled with a wide variety of people. It was a big city. It was Jewish at its core, but it would have been very accustomed to dealing with Gentiles and Roman soldiers who are passing through and traders. And so just looking at the geography is telling us what kind of environment Jesus is choosing to go into and the kind of environment he's choosing in order to train disciples how to take on a ministry after he's not there. So he makes sure, and again, descriptive, we don't get the reasoning in the text, but we do get a lot of it. He purposefully goes and shows his disciples how to interact with a wide variety of people. And the geography helps us understand what the culture of these different places he goes to would have been like.
Yeah. I mean, as you say that, I even think about one of the early things he did with his disciples was took them over to the region of Decapolis, where he delivered the man from 1,000 demons. Well, if we don't read that in the context of the land, you miss a lot of insights about why did Jesus take them over there at that time? What was he trying to accomplish? What was the strategic logic behind going over there, delivering that man from demons, and then zipping right back?
Right. Yeah, it's great. Like I even that example, I love it because there's even images within that story that only make sense if you realize it's in the Decapolis. I mean, one, there's pigs on the hill. Why are there pigs on the hill? Because the people in the Decapolis eat anything. They don't have kosher laws, right? And when it references a big city that is it's like, well, what is the big city? It's a Decapolis city. What do those look like? How do they function? The fact that the demons call themselves Legion, which is a really good Roman name in a really good Roman city. Yeah. And now you start to pull out these other little underlying themes to the text in terms of who actually has authority. Is it the Roman powers that be, or is it the God of the Jews? Yeah. And And is the God of the Jews the God of everyone? And some of those questions get to be teased out only because you understand the geographical basis of where he is.
Yeah. Yeah. And the disciples had to think he was nuts.
Yeah.
Going into that area. I mean, and so what an impactful lesson. I know he went over there and healed that man, but just the teaching moment, the leadership lesson built into that for those guys at that time was so strategic as well.
Absolutely.
Let me ask you this. At the beginning of Jesus' public ministry, he met several, like right after his temptation, he met James and Andrew and John and Peter and Nathaniel and Philip, not James, but he met those five. Eventually, those would become his apostles, but not right away. I grew up in Sunday school. Jesus was baptized. He did his temptation. He found his 12 guys, and boom, they went and changed the world. And as I began to study it chronologically, it didn't quite happen that way. Jesus waited some time, according to my account, around 21 months before he appointed the 12 to be his apostles. Now, he was interacting with them before that, and he called them to be his disciples before that. But didn't even really call them to be his disciples, from what I can tell, until he got to know them for a period of time. Yeah. So what cultural perspectives or practices of that time might shed light on Jesus' selection process for disciples?
One of the things that I thought of as you were asking the question that is a little bit of a tangent, and then let's come back to your question, unless I forget where the tangent goes. But I think there's something about, and again, until we really anchor the text in geography, culture, and history and understand it, what happens is in one verse, Jesus is in the wilderness being tempted. In the next verse, he's calling someone as a disciple. In the next verse, he's doing something else. And it seems to be these happened like within seconds of each other. And what we miss out on is, walking from one place to the other, going from the Judean wilderness up to the Sea of Galilee to call Peter. I mean, that's like you're walking, that's a significant amount of time and things are happening. So we lose sense of timing. And so I love
Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't include the early Judean ministry.
Right.
There's 9 months right there that those guys just skip.
Right. And so I love that you even point out the fact that there is a timeline in the discipleship making and in the apostle making, because we don't pay attention to that when we're just we're going from one miracle to another miracle in the Gospels. And I think even if we start really early and even thinking of disciples who are disciples and Jesus calling disciples, we use that terminology all the time. Jesus called his disciples, and in a way he does, because in the Gospels he's saying, come and follow me. But that already is a weird thing in his own culture, in his time and place, because students went out to find a rabbi and had to ask permission to become a disciple of a rabbi. And the rabbi could put them through a whole series of exams. Mac, tell me, how many times in Deuteronomy does the word remember come up? Yeah. You're like, 12. You have to have things memorized. You have to be able to know what is in the oral tradition. How do they have conversations with each other? And the fact that Jesus is encountering people all the time who are already in the family business, like thinking of James and John, sons of Zebedee, out with teams of people fishing. When Jesus calls them, it's an indicator to us, the readers, that these guys weren't looking for a rabbi. Right. They were just doing normal life. Yeah. But Jesus sees them and sees something different in them. And then he calls them into the adventure, which will be following him. Yeah. And so we have those very personalized stories of people like Jesus calling them forth, which we also see the scribes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees. To them, they recognize he's a great rabbi, but that raises all kinds of red flags, right? What education do your disciples have? They're just very simple people. Why are you choosing them instead of letting them choose you? That kind of thing.
Yeah. Would make no sense to them.
Yeah. And then I think, even as we again go through the timeline, we start to see everywhere Jesus goes, he picks up larger crowds of disciples. Yeah. There are 70 disciples at one point that are following him. There are men and women. There are older people and younger people who are following him, who are considered to be disciples. But there's the very specific, again, active imagination of Cyndi Parker, of the looking in the eye of 12 of them and saying, I need you to be a direct eyewitness to who I am. And I need you to take on my behavior and my way of interacting with demon-possessed people, say, because they would have seen him interact with this demon-possessed person. And I need you to mimic me in the places that you go to. And that becomes that very, very specific calling for those specific 12 disciples, or 11 after Judas ends up dying, but the 11 who end up going out and being apostles for Jesus.
Talk to me about what was the significance of being a disciple, chosen by a rabbi. What was that significance of those disciples that followed rabbis? What was it, a big deal in that culture? I mean, how significant was that?
I love this question, because this is such a good cultural question for those of us who, I think all growing up, people would say things like, I'm being discipled by someone, and they meet up once a month to read a book. And then I went to Israel and I started talking to rabbis, even modern rabbis, and going, what is discipleship? And realizing
we don't do it in America.
No, it's something so vastly different. Because being a Talmudim, being part of the students to a rabbi, I think some of the other rabbinic writings talk about, it's like you put your nose between the shoulder blade of your rabbi, right? Like that's how closely you're walking. You should be covered in their dust when you walk from one place to the other. You're so close to them. You're so thirsty for their words and wisdom. And it's all about, like, you stand when your rabbi stands, you sit when your rabbi sits, you travel when your rabbi travels. You are ingesting the words of your rabbi, like, into your soul. And I wish I knew the reference off the top of my head, but I don't. But there's also rabbinic writings that talk about, if your father who gave you life, like if your father's to fall into a well and your rabbi falls into the well, who do you save first? And they would say, you always save your rabbi first, because your human father gave you life, human life, but your rabbi is giving you spiritual life. And that is the more valuable. And so that's a whole different way of framing the intentionality. Like, I'm molding my life around who this rabbi is. And it puts a whole different weight on being the mentor or the rabbi in a relationship.
It was such I don't know if you've watched The Chosen season 3, but there's a moment that I love, because, I always thought, James and John, they were their daddy's right and left arm in business. Jesus takes them away from the business. That was Zebedee's got to be mad. But then once I began to realize the significance of a young man being chosen to follow as a disciple, follow a rabbi, I'm like, oh, he wasn't mad. He was honored. And in the episode, there's one scene where Zebedee is standing there talking to a couple of people, and he said, I'm the most envied father in all of Capernaum. My son is following the rabbi. And I love that, because I was like, I understand that now. So good.